Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Heroes and Homecomings, Norman Rockwell in World War II. America's most beloved illustrator created dozens of images related to the Second World War. What happens when an artist known for his use of humor tackles such a serious subject as war? This program explores how Rockwell's work departs from earlier artistic interpretations of American conflicts and considers how and why Rockwell chooses specific wartime themes to present to the millions of readers of the Saturday Evening Post. And this program is led by art historian Jane Oneail, who's the owner of Culturally Curious. Jane holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. Jane is a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of her state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, as well as the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. So all 152 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jane for joining us here this morning. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Norman Rockwell. We're all in for a treat. One of my favorite things to do in the world is to look at and talk about Norman Rockwell's works of art. They're just so charming, so detailed, so rich with information. And so we're going to be looking at really just a small slice of Norman Rockwell's work today. And it's kind of perfect for this month, the fact that tomorrow is Veterans Day, that we're looking at his images associated with wartime. So there's a lot to cover. Let's dive right in. We'll be getting back to this image that you've been looking at for the past few minutes in just a little while. But let me give you the lay of the land, how we'll move through the material today. We'll get started with a very brief introduction to the artist. You probably already know a lot about him, which is why you're here today. Then we're going to do a little detour. And I'm going to give you the briefest overview of what war has looked like in American art prior to Norman Rockwell. So we have a sense in terms of what he is sort of leaping from. And then we'll turn our attention to his wartime images. We have a prequel with a couple of World War I images. We have a series based on a character named Willie Gillis, The Four Freedoms, which I know are a favorite for so many. Norman Rockwell was so great at showing us heroes at home and then the homecomings. So a lot to cover. Let's dive in. Norman Rockwell, sort of the man and the myth. We see him here in this photograph of the artist at work here. And I love this picture because he's looking out at us and sort of smiling here. And I think that's why so many people are attracted to his artwork, because there's humor and humanity there. Now, just to get us all oriented, Norman Rockwell was born before the turn of the century, and he died well into the era of disco, a really nice long life and a very long and productive career. He's generally known as America's favorite illustrator, and that title did not bother him at all. He didn't aspire to be a fine art artist or sort of bristle at this idea that the work that he was producing was sort of lesser than the work from the realm of fine art. Now, he did have formal training as a painter, and when he was producing these images, he's painting full size, full scale oil paintings, very detailed oil paintings. And we'll be talking about his process a little bit as we move through today's program. Now, he's most closely associated with the Saturday Evening Post, where he worked for 47 years, producing more than 320 covers for them in that time. In the space of a given year, he could paint usually around 10 covers for them. So he was pretty prolific and highly productive in terms of his artistic output. But he also worked for a number of other publications, produced calendars and images for all kinds of commercial purposes. Now, Norman Rockwell is an artist that we closely associate with the very character of America, right? So when we think of Norman Rockwell, we think of sort of this high level of patriotism, and it's for good reason. Now, first, he had a very long relationship with the Boy Scouts of America, that organization. He painted calendars for them for about 6 decades. And so we can see him here in a self-portrait from the 1960s. Norman Rockwell has painted himself standing at an artist's easel with his paintbrushes in hand, and he's surrounded by these Boy Scouts who, some of them seem sort of curious about what he's doing, or maybe even more curious about what he's painting here. So most of his images for the Boy Scouts include references to American history here. So we have these 2 scouts looking over their shoulders at this imagined view of George Washington genuflecting in the background, looking as though he's about to head into battle, and certainly looking like this awe-inspiring father of our country here. Now, continuing on with this notion of Norman Rockwell and these patriotic themes, he painted several portraits of US presidents. We don't normally associate a commercial artist doing that sort of thing, but he painted presidents on both sides of the aisle, I think is worth noting. And towards the end of his career, he was also asked to paint the cover of American Artist magazine for their July issue in the year 1976. So it was the bicentennial. And so Norman Rockwell paints himself right alongside the Liberty Bell. He recognizes that he himself is almost as much of an icon as the symbol is over here. So we'll wrap up with this notion of patriotism with a view of Norman Rockwell sitting in his studio holding the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which was awarded to him in 1977 by Gerald Ford. So Norman Rockwell, in every way imaginable, was very effective in reflecting American culture in his artwork, but also helping to define it. And so his images around World War II, we'll see, really helped to shape the way Americans thought of that particular conflict. Now, before we dive into those images, let's take a quick detour to consider what war looked like in American art prior to Norman Rockwell. So going all the way back to the beginning, we've got an image of the American Revolution here, painted by the artist John Trumbull. And this is the Battle of Bunker Hill, with the death of the very popular General Warren being slayed right here in the foreground. Now, John Trumbull was obviously an accomplished artist, but he was also an aide-de-camp to General George Washington. He was there at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he witnessed the whole thing. But he didn't paint this picture until about 11 years later. And he wasn't so much as relying on his memory in order to construct the image, but he was looking back at the history of art and the way battle scenes had been painted prior to that. He was also thinking about images of martyrs in the history of art. So you could draw close associations with the death of this general here and images of Christ dying. So he's really relying on compositions, formulas that existed prior to the Battle of Bunker Hill. Yet I think as Americans, we tend to look back at his images and imagine this is what it looked like. We imagine them as kind of perfect records of this particular war. Now, if we fast forward to the Civil War, we have 2 illustrations here by the artist Winslow Homer. And Winslow Homer had been hired by the publication Harper's Weekly. He was sent to the front lines of the Civil War to document what he saw, send his sketches back to the magazine, who reproduced them as engravings. We can see with the cavalry charge over here, the chaos of the war, how terrifying it would be to be in the middle of it. We don't have the tragic death of a single soldier here. We have the potential for the death of hundreds, if not thousands here. We can't even tell who's winning, who's losing, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. But perhaps his most famous image from the Civil War is this image over here from 1862. It's called The Sharpshooter. And with this image, Winslow Homer is giving us a peek at what modern day warfare had become. It wasn't soldiers lining up honorably across a battlefield and running towards each other. Instead, they were camouflaging themselves in trees, behind fences and boulders. And they had now the technology with firearms to be able to just take out someone's life. And for Winslow Homer, this was terrifying to publish an image like this, shared with the world, really, just how in some ways dishonorable warfare had become. It was a haunting image for the subscribers of Harper's Weekly. And ultimately, Winslow Homer would then turn this into a finished painting, which is now at the Portland Museum of Art up in Maine, if you'd like to go see it yourself. Now, photography also factored in with the Civil War. And I think we also have the tendency to look at photographs of that particular battle or that particular conflict and imagine that they are perfect records of what happened there too. We're looking at an image here by the photographer Timothy O'Sullivan called A Harvest of Death at Gettysburg. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is that the processing time for photographs was long, still very long. It was a long delay. So we oftentimes see images of death, but that didn't stop photographers from sometimes composing these scenes. We know for a fact that some of these Civil War photographers were actually dragging bodies around in order to create a more compelling composition. So it's interesting that we're always sort of dealing with this tension of what is real and what is composed. The last war image that I wanted to share with you before we go back to Norman Rockwell is this monumental painting by the American expatriate artist John Singer Sargent. This is an image from World War I, and it's called Gassed. So these are all British soldiers, I would imagine, who have been blinded, wounded by the use of chemical weapons, by the use of mustard gas here. So we can see this enormous pile of bodies here in this 20-foot long painting, and then a column of soldiers who are leading each other towards a medical tent that is just outside of the frame of the picture. Beyond them, more bodies just waiting to be seen, and another column of blinded soldiers. So we have literally the blind leading the blind. There's this one figure here whose knee is raised so high. And there's something about that one figure that always just kind of grabs at my heart there, because that reminds me of how any of us sort of stumble through a space when we have no idea what our bearings are, when we can't see our way, and we don't know, where our next step should be placed. So for John Singer Sargent, with an image like this, he's really talking about the human impact, the wounded, the people that survive after a battle whose lives are forever changed. So we have this big spectrum in terms of how artists have engaged with the subject of war since the American Revolution. Well, let's turn to Norman Rockwell and let's get a sense in terms of how he engages with this material. Our prequel here is World War I, because he was alive and working during World War I. He had actually tried to enlist in the army, and Norman Rockwell was a tall beanpole of a man, and apparently he didn't make weight. So he went home, drank a bunch of milkshakes, ate a bunch of bananas, went back, weighed in, and was able to enlist, but they just kept him at home as a wartime artist. So these are a couple of images that he produced in the 19-teens to reflect the First World War. And this first image, you can see, is really different from the images that we've been looking at so far. We're a long way away from, battle scenes and martyrs and the tragic loss of brave individuals. Now we're looking at a soldier face to face. He's smiling at us. We see his teeth. We never do this generally speaking, in the history of art. And here he is sitting in the wind-driven snow, but he's got a care package on his lap. It has this holly paper on it, so we know that it's probably close to the holidays. There's all sorts of good things in here: boxing gloves, a baseball, cigarettes, a book, and he looks particularly happy to be receiving either what I think is a scarf or maybe some very warm socks. And there's the little sarcastic sign behind him saying, "This is the Hotel Ritz." Obviously, it is not. This is an image called "They Remembered Me." And, the title right there just pulls at your heartstrings. We all begin to remember our own experiences about the first time we were away from our families for an extended period, and to get that first care package or letter and have that feeling of being connected and being taken care of. There's nothing as wonderful as that if you have to be away from your family. So the next image from World War I wanted to share with you is Norman Rockwell's Easter cover from 1919 for the Saturday Evening Post. And in this image, again, we don't see conflict, we don't see violence. Here we see, well, the faintest suggestion at it. There's some rubble here. We don't even get the sense that it's, a building that's been destroyed. But from that rubble, we see these three beautiful yellow tulips emerging, perfect for an Easter cover, right? It's about resurrection, it's about renewal. And this American soldier is tenderly watering those tulips with water from his own helmet. This is not a soldier who is, about being macho or particularly strong. He's tender. He's helping life to spring forth as opposed to taking lives. So the last World War I image I wanted to share with you is called Soldier and Comrades. So we see a young decorated soldier returning home from war, sort of marching proudly, presumably in his own neighborhood. And he's surrounded by the neighborhood kids. Some of them have sort of dressed up to emulate him. Most notably, this little sort of chubby boy in front of him who's got a makeshift ribbon or medal on his chest, a sword over his shoulder, and a bucket on his head. You just have to love it. And I think when we see an image like this, we can all sort of relate either to the little boys or the young man here. They might remind us of our sons, our brothers, our children, our grandchildren, and we can see the humanity in each one of them. Now we're going to shift gears, and I wanted to show you the first World War II image we're going to look at today. And you'll notice right off the bat a huge change here. By the time we get to World War II, there's different printing capacities for the Saturday Evening Post, but there's also a different editorial priority. And that priority is to provide as much detail as possible. So no more white backgrounds. Norman Rockwell is not just describing figures, he's describing whole places. And in this scene here, isn't it just a stunning picture? In this scene here, we have a little girl who's got two braids, two pigtails here, and we can see that she has no shoes on. We get the sense that she has been affected by this conflict. Perhaps she's even been orphaned here. And this American soldier has laid down his weapon. Here it is in the foreground, and he's sitting down and feeding her his own rations. Look at how he leans in with love and care and concern to feed this little girl here. It's as though he's her father or her pediatrician or something. It's a remarkable image. And Norman Rockwell entitled this work, The American Way. So once again, his wartime images are not about violence. It's not about winning at all. It's about America feeling really proud about men and women serving abroad, showing their humanity, and not even necessarily their bravery, but just what incredibly great people we can feel proud of. So let's turn our attention to Norman Rockwell's first series here associated with World War II, and it's called Willie Gillis. Now, Willie Gillis is this little guy right here. This is sort of like a lesser known thread of Norman Rockwell's a total output of work, but he decided he wanted to tell the story of World War II sort of through the experiences of this young man, an invented character named Willie Gillis. And in his mind, Willie Gillis would be a tiny little runt, a little underdog that all of America could root for. And so we can see here, this little guy, Willie Gillis, looks like he's 10 or 12 years younger than the soldiers that surround him. And so, of course, as an underdog, we're all going to be rooting for him all along the way. Norman Rockwell was living in Vermont at the time. He went went to a square dance and he saw, I think it was a 15-year-old boy named Otis Buck, and he thought that will be my Willie Gillis, and he signed on to be a model for this series. So you'll see Willie Gillis's expressions and reactions to things really make the series. So let's sort of dive in and follow him through basic training here. We see a familiar theme. Willie Gillis is learning to be a soldier. He got a care package from home. It's stamped with red lettering here, food, no delay. So he's got a sweet treat from home. He's being remembered, but he also has this sort of peacock feather fan of soldiers behind him who seem very determined to get their hands on whatever he got. Notice how they are all marching forward with fists clenched, peeking over his shoulder. Willie Gillis knows that there's no hope in the world for this. He does get to come home from basic training, and it's that wonderful reminder of just how great it is to crawl into your own bed after time away. So we can sort of follow his path here. He has peeled off his socks and shoes, taken off his uniform, and gotten into this underneath, really, this handmade quilt that's probably been in his family for generations. And he's fallen fast asleep in his own bed underneath the sign, "Home Sweet Home." We don't see his face, but we get the sense that he's just lying there smiling. There's nothing like getting back into your own bed after time away. Now, if you have really good eyes, you might notice that there's a clock over here and it's nearly 10 a.m. Norman Rockwell is even giving us the faintest suggestion of morning light sort of streaming into the room. Is there anything better than sleeping in once you go home too? But notice the date here. It's November 29th, 1941. So everything is about to change for the US and for Willie Gillis. So he is back in the Army. And in this case, it's well into 1942 now. He is doing dreaded KP. Here he is peeling apples, and he has been distracted from his work because he's received a package from home. In this case, it's the hometown newspaper, which has been annotated by presumably his parents. And here he is distracted by what's happening at home. He's got these wonderful arched eyebrows. Norman Rockwell had such a keen sense for how to portray surprise or any sort of silly emotion, really, with the arch of an eyebrow. And he was so good at directing his models to do just this. Now, let me tell you, back in 1942, Americans were still struggling with their media literacy in the same way that they do today. So there were a lot of people that thought that Willie Gillis was a real person. And they were writing into the Saturday Evening Post saying, is he okay? What's the latest? What's happened to Willie Gillis? I really hope he hasn't been wounded in a battle or anything like that. But people were eager to know what was unfolding for him. And so Norman Rockwell was happy to continue producing images on what was going on in Willie Gillis's life. And so he leaned into the humor of it. Here we have Willie Gillis with the USO. And in this wonderful image where Willie Gillis is looking right out at us with bug eyes and bulging cheeks, his cup is literally running over, food's falling off of his lap because he's getting all this attention from these lovely, slender ladies from the USO who form this nice little pyramid right around his face here. Now, Norman Rockwell is doing this wonderful thing to indicate how unusual and unfamiliar this female attention is for Willie Gillis beyond the facial expression, which just pulls us right into the picture. Notice too how he made him pigeon-toed in the way that he's sitting here. It's a really nice shorthand to portray just how sort of young and awkward somebody is. It's such a wonderful image. Of course, if he was sitting there with his feet side by side, he would look a little bit more put together. But here he practically looks like a child. Although he comes along pretty quickly because by a little bit later in the same year, by June of 1942, we can see in this very dark cover for the Saturday Evening Post, Willie Gillis is holding a pamphlet that says what to do in a blackout. It even has his name signed there. And of course, he's not actually reading it. He's looking over his shoulder at his lovely companion here, who is trying to peer at the pamphlet. She has this wonderful hat on with this white feather that sort of fans out. And then her gloved fingers are echoing that form. They're resting on Willie Gillis's shoulders. And of course, the expression on his face reads exactly, I know what to do in a blackout. So hijinks will ensue. Now, Willie Gillis, or I should say Norman Rockwell, sort of stumbled into a big problem at this point because his model up and enlisted into the Army. I think he had to lie about his age. And for Norman Rockwell, this presented a huge problem because he didn't just need his model standing in front of him. He would oftentimes take anywhere from 50 to 100 photographs of him after being sort of carefully posed. And then Norman Rockwell would work from the photograph. So if there's no model, there's no photograph, and then there's no painting. So Norman Rockwell had to figure out how to continue the story of Willie Gillis without having Willie Gillis in the scene. So this next image gives us a hint at how things will progress. This is called Double Trouble for Willie Gillis. And you can see what's unfolding here with just a minimum of detail. We've got 2 mailboxes, 2 gardening rakes here, presumably 2 women working on their victory gardens. They've gone and they've gotten their mail, and they both have pictures of Willie Gillis in their letters. And so there's this conflict between the 2 women. Now, I love to read body language. And if I were like a betting person, I would say this blonde is going to win out in this competition. She's leaning into the redhead space. She's right in her face. But Norman Rockwell never met a redhead he didn't like to paint. So this redhead who's sort of leaning back, but looking pretty stubborn here, she does win out in the battle for Willie Gillis's affections. And that brings us to this wonderful picture for a New Year's Eve cover of the Saturday Evening Post, where we can see the redheaded girlfriend lying in bed, sleeping peacefully. It's right at midnight. She's fallen asleep reading letters from her honey. And Norman Rockwell could include these kind of silly pictures of Willie Gillis in the background for reference. It serves as a nice sort of close parentheses to the home sweet home image that we had from a few years earlier. Now, how is Norman Rockwell going to wrap up this story of Willie Gillis? How do you tie it up neatly with a bow? Well, he comes up with a great solution, as always. This last image from the Willie Gillis series is from 1946. The war is over. What happens to Willie Gillis? Well, he benefits from the GI Bill and he goes to college. And so here he is sitting in the sunny windowsill at Middlebury College. You might be able to recognize the steeple over here at the church. And he's living this really comfortable life now with, there's signs and references to his service, but he's also smoking a pipe. He's got his golf clubs over here. And now he looks like a man. He doesn't look like the underdog anymore, does he? And Norman Rockwell is basically telling us that not only is Willie Gillis okay, but the rest of all of these young men and women who were able to come back from the war are really sort of set up for success now. It's such a wonderful series. And I think, to our own detriment, we don't know it as well as we do this next series, which I know is a favorite for so many. If you go to the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, you can see the 4 freedoms in person. And so we have a treat now, just sort of going through them and really sort of pulling back the layers for what each one of these images is really all about here. So of course we have our freedom of speech, freedom of worship or freedom of religion, freedom from want, and then freedom from fear. Norman Rockwell was galvanized after he heard Franklin Delano Roosevelt's State of the Union address in 1941, where Roosevelt outlined these 4 freedoms that every American should be entitled to. Norman Rockwell thought, yes, I want to paint this. I want to visualize these freedoms in a way that will have a, long-lasting impact for this country. And he went down to Washington, D.C. several times during the war and really tried to think about and pitch ideas where he could contribute to the war effort, but nothing really landed. He decided he would create paintings based on the four freedoms, and he labored over this. He spent about 7 months creating just these four paintings. So that's a little bit slower than his normal output there. And he lost 15 pounds in the process too. So this wasn't easy for him. And I think it wouldn't be easy for any of us. He wants to tell a story. He's a natural storyteller. But if somebody handed you a pencil and said, draw me a picture of freedom from want, where would you even get started? So let's sort of dive in to better understand each one of these images. We'll start over here on the left with freedom of speech. Now, Norman Rockwell didn't just want to visualize the freedom. He wanted to kind of tell a little story around it. And he based this freedom, or this painting, I should say, off of his own experience. This is a depiction of a small New England town meeting. And he had had the experience of going to a town meeting where somebody stood up and shared an unpopular opinion. And just the fact that the community members, the town members, yielded the floor to him, they listened quietly and respectfully, and they let this man sort of share his piece. Norman Rockwell thought that is the very embodiment of freedom of speech to me. And so he gives us this figure here who looks a little rougher around the edges than a lot of the other community members. Notice these men are wearing jackets and ties, and this man looks like he does manual labor. His jacket is less formal. It looks dirty. His hands look really rough. They look like the hands of a laborer. And yet he stands up, his head and shoulders are set against this black background, and his eyes almost have this unfocused look to them, like he's sharing this kind of visionary idea here. Now, this is what makes this picture so successful in so many ways, I think, is how different it is from the original sketch that Norman Rockwell put together, where you can see he still visualized a young man standing up at a town meeting, but here he's not really set apart from the community members. And here he doesn't even have his mouth open. He doesn't look like he's speaking. You'll also notice in this earlier draft, Norman Rockwell is showing community members that don't necessarily like what they're hearing. They look dismissive here. Whereas in the final picture, they're really giving him the floor and giving him their attention. So I think some of these things that he's kind of edited out have made for a better picture. Now, a lot of people look at this figure here and they say this man reminds them of Abraham Lincoln. And you're not wrong. Norman Rockwell loved Abraham Lincoln. He painted him at least 8 times over the course of his career. And in this particular image, you can see that he's sort of painting him looking up at him. Abraham Lincoln looks like he's about 13 feet tall here, but he's exalting him by looking up at him. And you get the sort of the same effect with the freedom of speech over here. So an unpopular idea that nobody tries to suppress. People listen respectfully here. Our next image in the series is the freedom of worship. Now, if we sort of zoom out for a second and look at these images together, you can sort of see that the freedom of worship doesn't really visually fit in with these other images. These are full color images. There's sort of vivid storytelling taking place, but here with freedom of religion, it's just these giant heads, and it's a rather monochromatic picture, isn't it? Well, this is a place where Norman Rockwell was sort of like got tangled in his own ideas. His original concept for freedom of religion was to show people of different faiths gathered together in a barber shop, enjoying each other's company. And here we have our Catholic priest. This is presumably a Protestant, and this was supposed to be a Jewish man sitting in the barber's chair. Ultimately, Norman Rockwell felt like he was relying too heavily on stereotypes, so he abandons this idea. But it was important to him to show people of different racial backgrounds. So you'll notice that he's including a Black man walking into the barber shop over here. And then in his final final painting for the series, you'll notice that he's including people of different skin tones here. This was probably the most important element to this picture here. And this was something that was actually prohibited by the Saturday Evening Post. He wasn't supposed to show African Americans unless they were in subservient positions. And he really wanted to press against that policy. And he thought there's no better place to do that than in freedom of religion. So he includes them here in the margins, emphasizing these huge heads, these kind of wrinkled hands, and showing that everybody, even if they're of different faiths, they're all generally pointing in the same direction, following the same ideas. Norman Rockwell was not religious himself, but he very fervently believed in the golden rule, this idea that you treat others the way you want to be treated. And he saw that as the germ, the seed for each one of these religions. So he shows all of these heads sort of in monochromatic colors here, unified in that way, and in that organizing principle. So let's turn our attention now to freedom from want. We will all be in this situation in about 2 weeks' time, right, at our Thanksgiving tables. This is such a remarkable image. And to think that it was painted just a few years after the end of the Great Depression. Norman Rockwell saying that in America, people are not starving. People don't need food. In fact, he's giving us this sort of sanctified middle-class American home with the white tablecloth and the white curtains and the white woodwork. I mean, this is a pristine setting, right? And here we have our matriarch and patriarch setting this giant bird down on the table. It's a multi-generational gathering here. And really, for the most part, nobody's looking at the food. Nobody cares that there's a big bird here, except maybe this guy. It's really about spending that time with each other, the interpersonal connections here. The food's just an opportunity to do that because in America, we have the freedom from want. What's really, truly remarkable about this picture is that Norman Rockwell included this figure down below in the right-hand corner. And actually, I mean, he cropped out this man's face just the way you see it. We only see his eyes, but he's looking out at us. He is extending the table to us. We all feel like we are a part of this middle-class dream in America because this figure is inviting us in. Now, Norman Rockwell used his own housekeeper as the model here for the matriarch, who, if you notice, she's the one holding up this big dish. She also cooked the turkey, and when she was done modeling, they sat down and ate it together. And Norman Rockwell said that was the only time he's ever eaten one of his models. Now, we'll wrap up with the 4 freedoms with this last one here, which is called the Freedom from Fear, 1943. And with this picture, we see 2 parents tucking in their little boys into bed at night. And we have this sense of peace and security in this scene. Now, the whole thing is really hinges on the newspaper in the father's hands here. And we can see that his glasses are hanging over the edge of it. You sort of get the sense that dad was downstairs sitting in his armchair, reading his newspaper. And then it was like, oh, we got to put the kids to bed. So they've gone up the stairs here. And he is still thinking about what he's been reading, because the headline here, even though it's upside down, we can see it says bombings and horror. And so he is reflecting upon what is happening in the world, and the fact that he can tuck his little kids into bed at night and not have to worry about anybody's security. Everything in this picture is really designed to draw your eyes down to these kids. Even the part in the father's hair, his arm helps to frame their faces to, even, the railing on the stairwell over here. It's all about that innocence and protecting that innocence. It's such a brilliant image. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit and turn to Norman Rockwell's depictions of heroes at home. It's a wonderful way to explore the subject of war without actually having to go to a battlefield. And of course, just like in World War I, Norman Rockwell never saw a battle himself. So he's going to make the people who are supporting the war effort the real heroes. Now, this is a lesser known Norman Rockwell painting, and what we're looking at is the rationing office. This was painted in 1944. Norman Rockwell got in touch with his own rationing office and he said, I'd like to portray exactly the kind of work that you're doing so that it can be shared. And it's sort of becomes a document about what the war was like. And they said, okay, you can come in and you can observe us, make notes and studies and all of that, but you have to make us look good. And Norman Rockwell said, if I do that, will you give me more rations? And they said no. So in this scene here, we can see Norman Rockwell has portrayed himself over on the far left, and we can see the rationing committee, which is just made up of everyday people from a community, men and at least a woman over here. And then we have a very relatable middle-class, middle-aged American man who's standing at the end of the table, humbly asking for more rations. And we sort of get a sense in terms of just how sympathetic and interested this rationing board might be. Now, I think it's a really interesting, compelling image here, but I also think that Norman Rockwell's studies of all the other people that he saw going before the rationing board is just as interesting. With these little studies, you can see exactly what people are struggling with. We have what looks like a veteran over here with holes in his boots. We've got a woman with 4 kids. We've got an older lady with a little dog. I mean, everybody's got their own issue that they're bringing before the rationing board. So it's not an easy job, to say the least. This next image here, it's a favorite for everyone, isn't it? Who doesn't love Rosie the Riveter from 1943? This is now at the Crystal Bridges Museum of Art down in Bentonville, Arkansas. So we are looking at a modern day hero, a modern day saint, really, because this Rosie has this little thin halo over her head. But this is a woman, a redheaded woman, who has moved from the home into industrial manufacturing. She's got this huge rivet gun on her lap. And in this moment, she is taking a break. She's eating her lunch and looking proudly down her nose, reflecting upon this work that she's doing. The rivet gun hose winds down here, and it brings our eyes down not only to her penny loafers, but also to the fact that she is stamping out Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Rosie the Riveter is playing an integral role in the war, even though she's at home working in manufacturing. We've got this billowing flag as a background here. So Rosie has these massive arms. I mean, there's something about her physicality here, in addition to her clothes and her shoes, that makes her seem masculine, really impressive, right? And it's not just because of the physical work that she's doing. It's because Norman Rockwell was, of course, thinking of Michelangelo's saints and prophets from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I think we talked about this maybe a couple months ago. And so you can see these huge arms, this big monumental form is really directly lifted from Michelangelo's work hundreds of years earlier. Now, the detail that I love here is that Norman Rockwell is in so many ways flipping the script on the history of art. And he has to, because women were flipping the script on sort of the history of women's work. In giving Rosie this faint little halo here, he is reminding us that in the history of art, when a woman has a halo, she most often has a baby in her lap, right? It's usually the Virgin Mary. But to put a massive rivet gun in her lap instead, I think is just such a wonderful compositional choice here. This is a modern day heroine, and she's setting a new standard for strength and for heroic work here. So Rosie's just so wonderful in so many ways. I think most people don't realize that that Norman Rockwell painted Rosie twice. This is called Rosie to the Rescue. It was painted the same year, 1943. It's oftentimes called Liberty Girl as well. It's that same red hair, no longer as physically impressive. In fact, this Rosie is burdened. She is striding forward, but she has so much stuff with her. She's not even able to stand upright. This is a Rosie literally wearing many hats. So everything that she's carrying speaks to all the different roles that women were stepping up to do while men were away fighting. She's delivering milk. She's got gardening tools for a Liberty Garden. She's got a nurse's hat on here. This is a typewriter on her back. She's got a lantern for flagging down trains, and she's even got a book for schoolwork back here. So women are carrying it all on. She represents, of course, all the women in this country wearing the stars and stripes here. It's, I think, a really smart way to honor women's contributions. All right, so we're going to wrap up with this last section here about homecomings. And this is where Norman Rockwell really, really shines. He is able to pull at heartstrings and in just such a talented way. It's remarkable. So this is a painting called Homecoming from 1945. And where do we start here? Well, let's start off with the fact that he's giving us this soldier who's returning home, a veteran who's returning home. We see him from behind, and therefore we project ourselves into his body. We are seeing this entire setting, and we're seeing all these people through his eyes. We're imagining how he's feeling as he's looking at this. And in this moment, his family realizes he's home, and his mother, it comes to the, through the door with her arms spread wide open. Is there anything better than being greeted by your mom like that? His siblings are coming down the stairs. The dog is flying through the air. This is as warm a welcome as anybody could imagine as they return home from war. The detail that I always love too is that his little sweetheart is hiding right around the corner here. She can't wait to get her hands on him either. But I think the real brilliance to this scene is the fact that Norman Rockwell is giving us a whole community greeting here. There's somebody working on the roof of this little porch. We've got somebody peeking over the fence, neighbors coming out of their door, neighbors up here looking out the window, kids climbing a tree, another person over here. So it's really a community welcome home. Now, let's take a look at this setting for a second. Norman Rockwell could have easily set this in middle-class America. It's an extension of Freedom from Want in some ways, but he chose this kind of run-down neighborhood in Troy, New York, to base his painting in. I mean, look at this. There's like debris in the yards here. There's nothing picturesque about this. So why choose this neighborhood? Well, it's densely packed. All of these people know each other. So if one soldier comes home, it's a celebration for everybody. Notice too the blue stars in the neighbors' windows. Everybody has somebody or multiple somebodies who are away fighting. So the return of one is really a joyous celebration for everyone here. Norman Rockwell makes us feel that joy in such a wonderful way, even though we can't see the soldier's face. Now compare this to the work of a fellow illustrator, N.C. Wyeth, who made his own homecoming painting the very same year. Once again, we see the soldier from behind, but here he's returning to a quiet farm. There's no sign of his parents or his sweetheart or his neighbors. There's a very happy dog. But in this case, with N.C. Wyeth's painting, I think it makes you sort of instead relate to maybe some mental anguish that this veteran is feeling coming home to this kind of somber scene, as beautiful as it is. Maybe he's sort of holding on more so to what he's experienced as a soldier. So in terms of somber experiences, this image that we started with today, the Homecoming Marine, is probably Norman Rockwell's most somber image. It's a painting of a redheaded veteran. He loves his redheads, who had been fighting in the Pacific. This is the war flag of Japan. And he is surrounded by all of these men of various ages, little boys to old men, who are leaning in with great curiosity to hear about his experiences in fighting in the war. If you have good eyes, you'll notice in the background that there's a poster that says "Garage Man, a Hero." So he's returned to the place where he worked prior to the war. And he is now a changed person. He did something in this battle that resulted in his heroism, almost certainly that resulted in the death of other people. And so he seems very reticent to kind of share this story. It's a quiet moment. It's a moment of reflection here. It's an unusual image for Norman Rockwell. Most of his scenes of homecomings are as joyous as you could imagine. Here's a Thanksgiving cover of the Saturday Evening Post, where we sort of get a combination of freedom from want and also a homecoming, where a mother is looking at her son who's returned from the Air Force with all of the love and affection you might imagine. Here he is contributing to KP, to kitchen patrol or kitchen duty, and he couldn't be happier about it. He is enjoying this time with his mother, and he also has his feet hooked up on the top rung of this chair too, making him seem like a little boy in so many ways. And you sort of get the sense that his mother is reflecting on how he's changed over, since he enlisted in the service. This next image is also about change. This is called Imperfect Fit. It's a veteran who has returned home in 1945 to glance over his shoulder at his own reflection after trying on an old suit that he owned before the war. He's taken off his uniform and he realizes he's really grown a lot. He's really changed a lot since he's been away. I think this is such a brilliant composition. It's all sort of divided up into all these triangles here, a triangle of a pillow, a triangle of a clothes hanger, and the little smile that Norman Rockwell elicits because of this moment of almost lack of recognition of yourself because of this kind of change. Now, Norman Rockwell also wanted to deliver on some romantic homecomings, some smooching, and he planned this cover of the Saturday Evening Post, which was a December cover. He started planning it months in advance, and he wanted to have it set in Union Station, Chicago. He actually got in touch with the train station and said, how do you decorate? I want to get it just right. And apparently he had so much sway in American culture at this point that the people who ran the train station said, however you want to decorate it, Mr. Rockwell, we will make sure that it looks just like that come December. So he gives us the scene with, a Santa raising money, people, carrying their Christmas trees and wreaths and packages and presents. But this is really also a scene about soldiers returning home and smooching their girlfriends. And the more you look, the more of them you can find in the scene. There's a lot of romantic reunions here that tend to remind me of the famous photograph of VJ Day in Times Square. So we have just two images to wrap up with. The first is called The Long Shadow of Lincoln. This is sort of a post-war image for Norman Rockwell. And it's as though he's mapping out America's future after this war. Lincoln, as I said, was Norman Rockwell's favorite president. And we can see just the suggestion of him in a sculptural bust in the top left corner here. This is Norman Rockwell standing alongside it, reflecting what Lincoln might guide Americans to do after World War II. At the center of the composition is a wounded veteran. We can see he has a crutch here and he has a leg that's been amputated. All around him in the the left foreground over here in the light are individuals that are helping with the renewal of the country. We have a builder, we have the nuclear family, a woman who is instructing young children, a man who is literally reaching a hand down to help people up. This is sort of the path forward. But on the right, in the top, we have people who are still suffering. And I think for Norman Rockwell, it was really important to show that suffering and also the suggestion of how they can be assisted. So we have people who are mourning the loss of soldiers. We've got a cross here with the dog tags on it. And across the top, these figures are supposed to be refugees from another country. Norman Rockwell thought it was really important for America to play a role in rehousing them, welcoming them here. And so he puts them right across the top of this particular image. So a really inspiring and profound message, sort of spelling out America's path forward. So to wrap up on World War II, Norman Rockwell gets this big assignment. He is tasked with creating the January 4th, 1946 cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And he's given a specific assignment. It's going to be the Statue of Liberty. So here it is, like this most patriotic day. We've just won a world war. What's Norman Rockwell going to do? Well, the Saturday Evening Post had featured the Statue of Liberty by multiple artists many times, and they were usually pretty straightforward depictions like what we see over here on the left. This is not by Norman Rockwell. So Rockwell begins to experiment a little bit, thinking about, is there a way to tell a story about humanity using the statue sort of as a backdrop? So in this initial sketch, you can see he's got all these different people assembled together at the base of the pedestal here, and he sort of scraps that idea. He gets in touch with the people that run the Statue of Liberty, and he says, do you have any photographs of people cleaning the statue? And they said, well, we don't clean the statue, but we do clean the torch, and so we can tell you a little bit about that. And that became Norman Rockwell's composition. Think about how brilliant it is to actually crop out most of the statue herself so that you can zoom in on these 5 people doing this sort of dangerous hard labor up here. He's given us just enough to make her recognizable: the crown, the curls here, the arm raised above the head with this torch. And the symbolism of that torch was just the most important symbol there is. You know, it's a symbol of leadership, America's new leadership in the world, and it's a symbol of freedom. And so America is guiding the rest of the world in this new endeavor of freedom. And so I think that this is such an artful composition. Norman Rockwell was so smart here. I love how he's added in the birds here just to emphasize, you know, the vertiginous heights that these men are working in. And they are cleaning this heavy leaded amber glass on the torch. And Rockwell made sure to make one of those figures African American. Now, somehow he sort of slid this past the editorial review for the cover of this particular magazine. And the finished painting was actually later acquired by the White House. So it was already on view, I believe, in the Oval Office when Obama was president. And during that time, there was a keen researcher who was studying reproductions of the work, noticed that African American who had been included there, and realized that Norman Rockwell was really trying to say something about freedom, liberty, and civil rights way back in 1946. And so when this was sort of brought to people's attention, I mean, even the director of the Norman Rockwell Museum was like, wow, Norman Rockwell really shouldn't have gotten away with that, according to Saturday Evening Post standards. When all of this was brought to light, it was reinstalled in the Oval Office above a sculptural bust of Martin Luther King Jr. to sort of recognize that Norman Rockwell was doing some pretty amazing progressive things to this wide swath of the American public, decades even before the civil rights movement, really trying to advocate for liberty for everybody. So we'll wrap up today just sort of reflecting on the incredible images that this man made related to this war, how he helped America sort of deal with the trauma of war by delivering these sweet images, these humorous images that made us all feel so connected to our soldiers and to each other. I'll end there for now, and I welcome any questions you have. I can see there's a lot in the chat here, and I'll do my best to try and start answering these. All right. I see this first question here, comment here from Lois that says, I've never seen a photo of Eisenhower smiling. Well, I'm glad I could share that with you. Carol says, I'm old enough to remember looking forward to the Saturday Evening Post. Love those Rockwell covers. Isn't it so wonderful too to think about how you could just sort of dwell with them for a week? It was a weekly publication. There was so much detail there, and you could really just sort of dive in and appreciate it. Lois also commented that Sargent's painting Gassed truly is horrifying. Ava asks, could Picasso have seen Homer's cavalry charge? The horse's head is in the same place as the one in Guernica. Wow, Ava, I'm going to have to go back to that. I'm doing a featured program next month on Picasso. So I'm going to have to see if I can draw any correlation there. That's really smart attention to detail. So thanks for bringing it up. Also some comments on, I think maybe some of those early World War I images. Let's see here. In the first image you show of World War I, it looks as if the soldier is wearing a mask as his face is outlined in black. Why is that? Let's see. I'm not sure if I noticed that. This one. Oh, I see what you're saying. It does sort of look like there's like a hard edge to this. I wonder if that is like a strap to secure his helmet on his head. That's actually a detail that I never noticed before. So thanks for bringing that to my attention. I'm just guessing that it's a strap to secure his helmet, but I could be wrong. Somebody might know military helmets better than I do. So feel free to pipe in if that's the case. Eileen shared too that Rockwell painted a picture of Willie Gillis with his ancestors who all served on the wall. I might have this still in my notes. I had originally included that in the program, but I cut it out because the program was getting too long. It's a great picture. It always reminds me of Forrest Gump when they talk about Lieutenant Dan and how his whole family had all served in every previous conflict in American history. And it's, I think, a great way to help people feel kind of related to the history of the US and how, you know, everybody has kind of played a role in keeping it safe over the years. Lois also said, notice how slim and beautiful those USO volunteers are. My goodness, right? They were as slender as you could ever imagine. Definitely idealized. Nancy said, I'm enjoying this so much. I'm so glad, Nancy. Somebody else says, looks a little like Lincoln, the man at the meeting. Why is he considered only an illustrator versus an artist? Some of his work is a bit like Whistler. I think this title of illustrator really comes from the fact that he was producing works on demand for patrons or for commercial purposes. But it's not a title that he ever took issue with, even though these were all finished oil paintings that were then reproduced onto covers. The connection to Whistler there is pretty interesting too. Barry asks, in the freedom of religion, what is the influence of the light focused on that one woman's face? Let's see here. Probably right here. Yeah. So I think, Mary, you ask a really good question. This idea that they're all sort of pointing in this general direction. And I mean, I think not to oversimplify it, but I think you could almost say that this is like the light of God. I mean, that they're looking to something that's divine, and that light source is sort of pouring in from the left, really illuminating her face in particular. I think that I would guess that's probably the artistic choice that he's making in that case. Joyce asks, where are the first paintings of freedom of religion and speech, the ones Norman Rockwell decided not to use? Are they in the museum? That is a really good question, Joyce. I'm not sure where they are. I dug them up actually sort of poking around online, but I'm not sure where they exist today. I hope they're in the museum's collection. I've only seen really rough reproductions of them. And so I would guess that the museum probably doesn't exhibit them that often, but that is something I should look into. Great question. Let's see here. What were his influences? Was he anti-war? Harvey asks. Well, I'm doing a featured presentation this month on the illustrations of the Civil War illustrations and paintings of Winslow Homer, who we looked at a little bit as like the precursor to Norman Rockwell. And as I'm getting more and more familiar with Homer's work, I realized that that Rockwell was really taking some notes from Winslow Homer. There's all these not necessarily similar compositions, but a similar approach to subject matter, I should say. Here's our Winslow Homer over here. So even though Winslow Homer was embedded with the troops for a short time, he also did scenes about, you know, women's contributions. They weren't quite Rosie the Riveter, but sort of similar ideas, similar themes. I don't think that Norman Rockwell was anti-war in particular. I can't really think of anything in his artwork that would suggest that, but I think that he wanted to emphasize the humanity and of the soldiers on his covers, as opposed to purely their bravery or during conflict, because he wasn't showing the conflict. Rosamond, thanks for your kind comments. Pat as well, and Marjorie. Roland, wow, you just made my day with another nice comment. Thank you so much. A great hour. I'm 88 years old, so I lived through those years when Norman Rockwell painted the US. Oh, Cynthia, I hope this was a fun hour for you. They're such sweet pictures, aren't they? Is there another museum besides the one in Stockbridge? Anne asks. And there is another museum. It is in Vermont. I'm embarrassed to say I've never been there before. I think that it's more of his reproductions, more so than original oils. But maybe somebody else who's with us today could speak to that. I really have to get to that Vermont museum. Unga asks, what did he paint for Saturday Evening Post between Willie Gillis in 1942 and 1946? There were other Willie Gillis images that he painted. It was a longer series than what I showed you. I think I showed you some of the images that I found most interesting. So he was continuing to paint all along. I'm trying to think of like, I think all of these images that we looked at sort of filled in some of those gaps. So, I mean, the most important piece of the Four Freedoms, which I failed to mention. I can't even believe I failed to mention this. So these were painted in 1943, and ultimately they were published in the Saturday Evening Post. And they were also the finished oil paintings were part of a traveling exhibition that was used to help raise funds for the US Treasury during the war. And ultimately it raised $132 million for the US Treasury. I can't think of a more patriotic act by a single individual. I mean, Norman Rockwell is astounding to me for that reason. And I mean, like I said, he labored over these. He really struggled with it. So, so I'm sorry I forgot to mention that very important fact along the way. So he was continuing to produce works all along the way, whether it was Heroes at Home or the Four Freedoms. Sorry I didn't make that explicit along the way. Gail says, thank you. We used to visit the Norman Rockwell. Oh, they used to go to the museum each weekend. Well, if you get a chance to go back, maybe you'll see these works in a new way. Such kind messages. Thank you so much. Ada sort of mentions that there's some tension between our times today and the way that we perhaps think about conflict. And I'm so aware of that too. I feel like there's so much to learn from these images, and so much to reflect on what has changed, what's the same, or even just the ideas that are there. So I'm glad you're drawing those connections too, Ada. Thank you so kindly for all of this. Thank you. Did Norman Rockwell ever use actors as models? It seems to me that the soldier feeding the little girl looks like Gary Cooper. Oh, what an interesting statement. Okay, so if that's the case, I'm not sure, but I do know that there's a lot of art historians today that sort of think of him as like a movie director. And in fact, Spielberg, George Lucas, they're all collectors of Norman Rockwell's work because he could direct his models so effectively. And because he was taking so many photographs of them, there's a lot of people that think if he were alive today, he might be directing movies himself. But I'm not familiar with Gary Cooper, but perhaps that is him. I'm not sure. That's an interesting connection you made. Ian says, I think that Rockwell uses many of the same models in many of his paintings. I recognize the man in freedom of speech in some of the others. I actually just made that connection today as well. And freedom of speech, we've got this one guy sitting there. This guy over here, we can see him in both paintings. And then I think you see him in the study for freedom of worship over here. So yeah, he definitely goes back to some of the same models. He's living in a small town when he's painting this. I don't think he had too many people to choose from. Thank you to everybody who's writing in these very kind comments. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad that people were seeing things today that they hadn't seen before. In my teenage years, somebody says I would buy a Rockwell calendar every year. I went to the museum in my 20s and loved it. Highly recommend it if you are a Rockwell fan. I concur. Oh my goodness. June says, my great uncle is the doctor in Norman Rockwell, visits a family doctor. Norman Rockwell's painting visits a family doctor. My dad says his uncle would never have had a dog in his office. Oh, that's so funny. Norman Rockwell knows that people love dogs though, right? Joanne, thanks for your kind words. Dora too. The Vermont Museum is actually a gallery selling reproductions. Thank you for clarifying, Michael. So if you're itching to have some of these on your walls, that might be a good destination. Oh, Huck Finn is here. Oh my goodness, you had tears on your eyes. Thank you for sharing that. That's so sweet. Let's see. Anne here says, I hope we hear more from you in the future. We are doing a program next month with the Tewksbury Library and perhaps some partners. It's going to be Norman Rockwell's Christmas images. So I hope you can join us for that one. Hopefully it will be just as much fun and just as moving. These kind words, oh my goodness, you guys make my day. And I haven't even looked at the Q&A yet. Why was he called an illustrator and not an artist? I think we got into that. I think I answered that again during the chat, Alice. So I hope you feel like that's been resolved. Mostly because this was work for commercial purposes that was commissioned. Wonderful presentation. His wife was a huge influence on his career as an artist. You know, I really have to explore that a little bit more. I'm in the process of putting together a new program that's really just a straight introduction to Norman Rockwell. And there's a lot about his biography that I'm not as familiar with, but I do know that it seems like his last wife was sort of like a force of nature. So I'll get more familiar with that. Were the 4 freedoms produced to sell war bonds? I think I touched on that. That was that incredible fundraising that he did as part of the traveling exhibition. And what museum was John Singer Sargent's First World War port? That painting is in the Imperial War Museum in London. And then did Rockwell's paintings change with the Vietnam War? Oh, everything changes for Norman Rockwell in the 1960s. I've got a whole other program on that, but at that point he's left the Saturday Evening Post and he's really interested in painting cultural revolutions. Yes, it profoundly changes, but he's not necessarily depicting Vietnam specifically. Anne says, what is his connection with red hair people? I think they're just visually striking is really what it comes down to. So I think we hit upon almost all of these, Robert. And his first wife, I don't have a great answer for you there, but I'm going to dig into that a little bit more in this next year. So thank you everybody for sticking around for all of the Q&A too.
So I just can't get enough of Jane and I can't get enough of Norman Rockwell. So as Jane mentioned, we're hosting a very Rockwell Christmas with Jane on Thursday, December 15th at 11 o'clock. So 5 weeks from today, Thursday, December 15th, 11 o'clock, Norman Rockwell and Christmas. So look for an email from me later today with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual art history presentations, including the aforementioned A Very Rockwell Christmas. So Jane, thank you so much. Really enjoyed this, learned quite a bit. Want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the libraries in Canton and Wilmington. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Jane.
Thank you. Have a good one. See you next month.
Yep. Bye-bye.